Good evening and welcome back again, Realty Pros, to our Thursday evening agent training. This evening, we're going to be going through the fine details of the My House Porter platform and those terms and conditions. We want to make sure that everybody understands those, that you guys know how to explain them. And if we have time, we're going to go through the open house checklist as well, your marketing piece for your open house, to make sure that you know how to take full advantage of that one-day open house that we market through the My House Porter platform. Okay, so just to touch base on our Porterhouse Realty Talks today, we were going through some of the new features that we've learned through all of our trainings since we've been in our training for the Boomtown platform. And I was very excited to hear all the things that you guys learned today, because again, we're all learning together. So there's some things that you guys may be able to pick up faster and share with the group. And by all means, we encourage you to do so. We're looking to have those resident experts in-house. So I know earlier today we called on D'Amica because she had already done the social media syndication. So if you guys need help with that, you know which of your colleagues to give a call. But for now, we're going to go ahead I want to show you really quickly in your BrokerMint library, in your dashboard. As you can see, all of your updates are there. So check there on a regular basis, because the updates, they are changed regularly for you guys. And your useful links, as you can see, Boomtown is already there. So right from your BrokerMint dashboard, useful links, you see your Porterhouse training channel. And we're going to go through this when we go through our orientation for all the systems and everything on Saturday, April the 9th. For now, I just want you guys to know just about everything that you're going to need immediately. You will be able to access it from one platform right here in your dashboard. So your training videos right there. So if you wanted to click on that, go to your Porterhouse YouTube channel, all the training videos come directly up there. Your website, the Porterhouse website, Boomtown is right there. The auction site, so My House Porter is right there as well. Those links and the sites have been fixed for the mailing, the mailers, and for your Porterhouse swag t-shirt orders. Those were having some glitches and they have since been fixed. So just wanted you guys to know you're able to go ahead and utilize those directly from your dashboard, and they are fully functional. Your Maryland Realtors, your local, I've had a couple of questions about mdrealtor.org. Want to let you guys know this is here in your dashboard for you. So when you see that Maryland Realtors local board forms, any questions that you guys have about forms that you're not able to access within the BrokerMint library, they are right there in your Maryland Realtor local board forms. Click on that, it's going to take you to mdrealtor.org. Same thing with your DC Real Estate Commission, your Virginia board, and then your continuing education online. So we've done our best to put the most pertinent links there for you within your dashboard. Of course, you want to go to these sites outside and save all your passwords, usernames, and passwords so that you have ease of access. But for the sake of your convenience, we want to make sure that you can access it all from one seamless location. Does anybody have questions about anything there?
So the Virginia forms are in the board information.
The Virginia, so
board information are those the forms are in that?
That's a very good question. Those are not the Virginia forms. That's the Virginia board information. So the Virginia forms are going to be in your Zip Forms account. So any of our Virginia licensees who have a license in Virginia or DC or any other jurisdiction, and your Zip Forms, your Zip Form Plus account that you get through the board, all of your forms are there. Yep. All right. Great question. All right, so now let's go to our library and go to our My House Porter folder here. And there has been an update, as there was a typo on one of them. I wanted to just point this out to you guys because it has been amended to mirror what you're going to see on the My House Porter website. And it's in the field that talks about the earnest money deposit requirement, paragraph number 11, deposit, the high bid, right there with that 1% earnest money deposit. Your previous versions say 3.5%. So please be aware that that was a typo and that has since been corrected. So the corrected version is right in your library for you guys to use with all of your disclosures so that there are no discrepancy and everything is seamless and across the board. Does anybody have any questions about that? All right. Then let's dive a little bit more deeply in here, because I want to make sure that you guys are comfortable with the language And in the event that you get any questions from any agents, we want to make sure that you guys are just comfortable with what the provisions entail. All right. Numbers 1, 2, and 3, they are very much self-explanatory. Legal age, US dollars per the seller's approval. If you're outbid, you're going to receive an email notice so that they can return and increase their bid. As we have stated on a weekly basis, the success of the platform has provided that only one of the properties to date has made it to auction, because all the rest of them have received the overpriced offers from buyers saying, hey, can we submit an offer now, so as to avoid having to go through the competition on the platform. So that being said, when you get to the point where you have the bidding on the platform, if there is a competing bid, you can let agents know that them and or their buyers, whoever registers on the platform, they are going to receive a notice so that they can return and increase their bid. Either that, or they can set whatever their maximum is, just like an escalation clause in a contract. And they'll be able to let the system know, hey, this is the maximum that I'm willing to bid on the property. And they set the increments in which they want it to go up, so that the platform will compete for them in their absence. All right. Now, number 5, seller reserves the right to accept any offer at any time. That is very purposefully articulated there, because you guys are going to have agents to say, do I have to wait for the auction? Can I submit the bid now? And I want you guys to tell me how you answer that question based on the previous trainings that you had. If someone says, hey, can I submit an offer now? What are you going to say?
An offer now, and it may be considered by the seller as an option to consider that offer.
Aurelia said you can submit it now for the seller's consideration. Anybody else? Anybody have any other thoughts about? Does everybody agree?
Yes.
Then you are all correct, because absolutely. What about if you get to the day of the open house and people say, well, can I submit an offer right now? What about then? Can they submit an offer?
Yes.
Aurelia said absolutely. And is that Joy said yes? You are.
Yes.
Does anybody have a different thought?
I don't have a different thought, but I have a quick question. So if you started off by way of auction, and it doesn't make it to the auction, do you still keep the same terms as the auction, or it turns into a traditional sale?
Excellent question. It turns into a traditional sale. So during and after the auction terms are what they are, and they're already disclosed in both your disclosures as well as on the site. They do not come into effect until the auction and after the auction. Now, that being said, can anybody tell me something that you're going to want to make sure that the offer includes, so as to be an acceptable offer to your seller and have them to even consider canceling the auction in the first place? Tell me a little bit about what a pre-auction offer would need to include in order to entice the seller to consider it. What are your thoughts?
Money deposit, well, 3.5%.
Aurelia said a good earnest money deposit and the 3.5% buyer's premium. Anybody else? Think about it, guys. So think about it from this perspective. You're working with the seller and you have an auction. I don't want you to change what you said just yet. I just want to give everybody else some food for thought. Hey, Kermon. I'm excited when I see your guys' cameras on. If you guys get a chance, turn your camera on. Let me see your faces. So you're working for the seller, and the seller has an opportunity. The opportunity is when the property makes it to auction, they have a potential for a lot of competition, right? Which is going to drive the price up for the property, provided that the property is priced correctly. That being said, you have somebody that comes to you in advance and they say, hey, Joy, I want to submit an offer. Hey, Aurelia, I want to submit an offer. You have an open house coming up. will your seller consider the offer? And you have a conversation with them. What things, of course, you can't reveal to them, but what do you want to ensure that that offer includes? And it should be evident, but I don't want to give it away, to make sure that it's worthwhile for the seller. Let's talk about some things that'll make it worthwhile. And if it's blaringly evident, it should be.
What he's expecting to get. But you can't tell him. I mean, you can't give
Tell
that
him.
information to-
Aurelia said you can't give the seller's minimum that he's willing to accept, and that's absolutely correct. You can't let them know that. But she said it needs to include the price point that the seller is desiring,
and the ones who can-
and the earnest money deposit as well as the 3.5% buyer's premium. Does everybody agree with that?
Yes, but would you add any form of an escalation?
So we can go through the whole spiel about writing winning offers. So the answer to that is going to be yes. The answer to what Aurelia said, yes. Because at this point, you're looking for the highest and best offer, right? You're not just looking for any offer. Because if you price the property, say by chance you price the property at 306 and you have it in the platform, you and I know that you put it in that platform for 10% below the market. You're not going to allow someone to come to you and say, hey, Joy, hey, Angela, my buyer's interested. If they offer the seller, what your starting bid price is the seller willing to cancel the auction? Absolutely not. That wouldn't even be worth the seller's time. You know what? Let me correct that. I can't say absolutely not. It is always up to the seller. Let me make sure that I say that correctly. Now, we know that it's going to be in the seller's best interest to get more competition, however, because we're not looking for, them to just offer the least amount. We're looking for competition. So everything that you guys said is correct. And Joy is talking about escalation clauses. That's correct as well. You're going to be wanting them to submit the highest and best offer with the best terms for your seller. And we want to have that conversation. Yep. The conversation you're going to have with them is such that if the offer is attractive enough or appetizing enough or appealing enough to the seller to have them to cancel the auction, then by all means, the seller reserves the right to do so. But it needs to be a very attractive offer in order to have the seller to even consider such a thing. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep.
Yes.
You got it. So let's talk about some of those terms of an attractive offer, writing a winning offer. Let's talk about some of those terms. Let's do this. I'm going to leave this for now because I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And that's one of our upcoming trainings for our spring series for our new agent training, writing those winning offers, but I don't want you to wait until then. So we are going to touch base on some of those things now. Let's see. Have some samples in here, working with buyers. All right, so let's consider some of these things. I'm going to open this up for you guys. Now, this does not take into consideration My House Porter or the current state of the COVID market with all of the competition, but there are some things that are going to be across the board as it pertains to the terms that you will offer. So let's just talk through a couple of them, very top line, so you know which items are of consideration in your offers. If we were to just look at the synopsis page for now, of course, the purchase price, right? The purchase price is going to be one of the most important features, the purchase price. How much are they offering? The financing type is a component, but not as huge. Earnest money deposit. Somebody tell me if that earnest money deposit is important, and if so, why?
It is important. And it shows how much skin they really have in the game in regards to wanting to purchase the home.
Spot on. There you go. So if I get two offers for 550,000 and I have one of them that has $1,000 earnest money deposit and one that has a $5,500 earnest money deposit, which one is the strongest offer?
That one with the highest earnest money deposit.
Absolutely. All right. How about the pre-approval or proof of funds? If the buyer has or does not have a pre-approval or has or does not have a proof of funds, is that a deal breaker? Aurelia says yes. What do you guys say? Is that an offer that can be ratified by the seller, or is that a viable offer that should be ratified by the seller without proof of funds or a pre-approval?
I would say no.
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 You are all spot on. So let's talk about that pre-approval for a minute, right? If, say by chance, the list price for the property is 500 and this buyer is aggressively offering 550,000, let's talk about that pre-approval. If you see that that buyer's pre-approval is for 550,000 and you get another one for the exact same price, this buyer is offering 550 as well, but their pre-approval goes up to 600. Which one of those is most attractive?
Yeah, 600.
Okay,
Yeah, the high-
elaborate.
the high pre-approval.
Elaborate on that. Aurelia said the 600 because they have the potential to go higher. Elaborate, give me more.
It shows to me that they're not willing to spend every single dollar that they're pre-approved for. And there's some room there. So you're not, it kind of reminds me of somebody who's given a credit limit of $10,000. Do you have to spend the entire $10,000, or, you might spend 5,000 of that and leave some room? Kind of similar to what Aurelia said as well.
That's a great thought. Anybody else?
Well, Ms. Porter, I think it does give you wiggle room. I think the more money you have available, the stronger the stronger your contract can be, because a lot of times, sellers don't want to think that you're right at the edge, because there's always other fees, there's always little things that can come up at the last minute. And if you're at your limit, you can just get kicked out, whereas someone else who has a little bit more money involved, like we were saying earlier, more skin in the game, so to speak, they have a higher chance of being able to really work with this thing. So if anything gets changed, or if the amount goes up, or if there's like little fees, they're still in the game.
You guys brought your A game this evening. That's what I'm talking about. Spot on for everybody. That's exactly what you want to consider. We all know that the approvals are done based on, of course, credit, income, and assets, but also your debt to income ratio. So if you have a buyer, just like Kermon said, they're borderline, that is not as well a qualified buyer as a buyer who is over qualified for the purchase price amount that they're submitting an offer on, right? So if you had to instruct your seller as to which of those offers was most financially sound, that is a talking point, and that is a point of consideration when we're reviewing these offers. Now, I say that very purposefully because you have some people who are of the mind that you don't let the seller know that you can qualify for more. You only give your pre-approval for the price that you're making the offer for. And that can really come back and bite you. I get it. You don't want to, let them know that you're willing to go for more, but letting them know that you have the financial capacity to be approved for more is in the buyer's best interest when there is a competing offer that's at the same price. And because there's no way for you to know that there's a competing offer at the same price, it's best to put your best foot forward. Spot on, guys. Spot on. How about seller concession? Is that a point of contention if you are offering, or if the buyer's asking for seller concession, right? So one offers 550, of the other one's 550, one's asking for 3% closing, the other one's not asking for 3% closing. They're offering the exact same amount. Which one is the stronger offer? The one that's not asking for 3%, all right? Now let's consider that seller concession. Because in this market nowadays, buyers are not asking for nearly as much seller concession, and most of the time they're not asking for anything at all. That has, been the story since about March of 2020. Now, that being said, you will have some buyers who still need seller concession. And if you guys are on the opposite end of the spectrum and you're representing our porterhouse buyers, what considerations are you going to make in the offer to ensure that they can get the seller help that they need? Let's talk through that. What considerations are you going to make when preparing their offer to ensure that they can get the seller help that they need? So the property is listed, they're offering 550,000. I see somebody has an answer. I see Skipper and Joy unmuted. Go ahead, Skipper, then Joy.
You can always, if their pre-approval is more than 550, you can always attach it onto whatever their highest offer price is and finance their closing, the closing that they need.
Spot on. Anybody else? Is that what you were going to say too, Joy?
Yes, that was what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Got it.
Absolutely.
So these are the considerations that you're helping your seller to make when you're on the listing side, but you're also making them on the buying side. So let's make sure that we dialogue both ways so you know which hat to put on when you're both vetting the offers with your seller and when you're making the offers for your buyer. All right, great. That's as it pertains to the seller concession. All right, now let's talk me through this transfer and recordation, the 50-50 split. Is that a point of consideration when submitting a strong offer? If so, why? Talk me through that.
Was one of the issues. Language, I think, when my house order said that it was paid by the buyer. But then there was another thing, I think it was right, that said that, I guess that would be a point of consideration.
Yes, it is a point of consideration.
The selling property, if
That's it.
whereas if they're saying, okay, we'll go ahead and buy it, we'll go ahead and pay for, the taxes, transfer taxes and recordation, then that's more of a win.
Absolutely. So Aurelia, if you guys couldn't hear her, I'm not sure if you can you hear Aurelia? If not, I'll go ahead and reiterate what she said. She said it
heard parts of it.
So it is a consideration because it's money out of the seller's pocket. So when you are working on behalf of the seller, you want to make sure that you're reviewing what the buyer's offer is as it pertains to transfer and recordation taxes. Because if it's a 50-50 split, then they're splitting it equally. If the buyer is paying all of it, then that's saving your seller thousands of dollars. So that's a tremendous benefit to your seller, because that means then at the settlement table, they're going to net more because the buyer is paying all the transfer and recordation taxes. If you're writing an offer for the buyer for the seller to pay all of the transfer and recordation, then please be aware that that is a tremendous consideration as it pertains to negotiating your offer, just like asking for closing costs and just like offering an amount over and above your list price. That transfer and recordation split, it adds up to real dollars and cents when it comes to the seller's net. Does anybody have any questions as it pertains to that?
I have a question on what we just covered for the 3%, because my question is, if the buyers already have to pay the premium and they offer something that's close to what their top lending approval amount is, and then the 3.5 has to be added, you have to be very careful not to go over that. Is that correct?
That is correct. When you're representing the buyer, so from the platform's perspective at Porterhouse, you guys are representing the seller. So you want to make sure that everything that we're doing is in the best interest of our seller, right? That being said, when you're on the opposite side of the fence and you're representing the buyer, what Aurelia is saying is you want to make sure that the buyer is not at the top end of their ratios, because if they need closing costs, then you got to add that on top of the purchase price. And if they have a buyer's premium, that's also added on top of the purchase price. So pay attention to what their pre-approved amount is, so as to make sure that they are not at the top with those considerations that have to be made on the buyer's behalf. So great comment. All right, what about contingencies, guys? You get 2 contracts. They're both identical. One of them wants one of them wants a 30-day financing contingency with 10 days to the inspection contingency and 30 days for an appraisal contingency. You get another offer. They're only asking for 14 days for a financing contingency, 5 days for an inspection contingency, and maybe 14 days for an appraisal contingency. Which of those 2 is the better offer for your seller? And why? Let's talk about what those contingencies mean and how they affect your seller.
Well, Ms. Porter, I can say this, because we know that in all of our contracts, time is of the essence. So a lot of the contingencies add to the time frame, and most of our sellers want to try to sell the house and do this in the quickest amount of time as possible. So I would think that a seller would want to have the least amount of hoops or hurdles to have to jump through, as possible. The only question I had was, it seems like now the pendulum is turning back to people having contingencies. There was a time, I remember, that we didn't care what your contingencies were, because we had people that had none, that had no contingencies, or, hey, look, I'm willing to work out the contingencies or whatever. But now it looks like it's starting to turn. So my question is, which contingencies are more acceptable, I would say, to a seller?
So that's a good question, and we'll address that at a later time. Right now, I want to address what you said, which was spot on. Time is of the essence in your contracts. And I tell you, Kermon, you're just showing off tonight. I think it's because you got your video on. You just been spot on with these answers. See, you have your video on, and then next thing you know, you're taking it away. Time is of the essence.
I'm trying to impress my wife because she's listening. So that's what I want her to think I know what I'm doing.
Well, great job. And you do. Hello, Christine. You are on point. That's why. So you're going to have Christine sit next to you for all of your trainings, because you're spot on. That is exactly it, guys. Does anybody have any other thought to add to that, or another consideration before I go into depth? All right, then we'll continue from there. Just like Kermon said, time is of the essence, right? What is a contingency? A contingency is a way for the buyer to back out of the contract without having any type of consequences. So if they can back out, get their earnest money deposit back, then you don't have a solid contract for your seller that's going to get them across that threshold of settlement, right? So the longer we extend those contingency periods, the more time we're giving the buyer the ability to back out without your seller having any type of recourse if the buyer backs out. Your financing contingency. If that buyer's agent's asking for 30 days, you need to counter, and you need to make sure you counter. Call that lender, say, how quickly can you get us a financing approval? And if I were you, I would push them. I would push for 14 to 21 days. 21 days is reasonable for the financing contingency. 14 days is very aggressive, but nowadays lenders have been able to get that in 14 to 21 days. So you want to make sure that you push back on those, because even if you have a fully ratified contract and you have those very long contingency periods, your contract is not yet solid, because you have contingency periods that are kind of out there waiting to be removed, right? That being said, the same thing goes for your inspection contingency. You're the listing agent. You get an inspection contingency for 14 days, or you get one for 10 days. That is far too long in our market. We need to be countering with 5 to 7 days, and you want to have that conversation with the seller. All of the considerations and counters and terms to be accepted or negotiated are directly between the buyer and the seller. That being said, you want to advise the seller as to what these contingencies mean and what those terms that the buyer is requesting are, how they're going to affect them and their timetable. And Kermon stated it perfectly. Time is of the essence. They want to sell the property as quickly as possible. So let's walk down that path. You get a financing contingency and they're asking for 30 days, and you get to that 30th day and the buyer's financing falls through. Now the property's going back on the market. Your seller is out of a whole month and there's no earnest money deposit to be given to the seller because the buyer was still covered by that contingency, right? So that being said, that seller is out of a whole month. Whereas if you cut that time in half, you're able to move. And if you needed to kind of quickly adjust and take another route, you could do that much more quickly with shorter contingency periods. Okay. And I'm going to say that and segue into Kermon's next question, because the contingencies are not the end of the world. It's long drawn out contingency periods that are. We don't want to have contingencies as much as possible, but 9 times out of 10, you will have a financing contingency, right? If it is FHA or if it's VA, you will have an appraisal contingency, okay?
What's the average time frame you suggest on that?
So I would counter with the same for both of them. I wouldn't allow anything more than 14 days for the appraisal contingency. And if definitely, so that appraisal the appraisal can actually be ordered as soon as the contract is ratified. Lenders oftentimes wait until after the property inspection has been done so that they know that the buyer is intending to move forward with the contract. And then they will call and order the appraisal. But you can actually put a clause in your contract that says appraisal will be ordered in 7 days, or appraisal will be ordered in 5 days. And you can stipulate that timetable for the lender. Very diligent lenders, they're ordering them right away. Lenders that are kind of, knowing, okay, we have a whole 30 days, we don't have to order it just yet because we order it. It might take them 7 days to go out, might take them 3 days to get it back, and they only need 3 days to review it. So they're going to order it kind of in that second half of that 30-day period, opposed to in that first half of the 30-day period. So when you're working on the seller's behalf, you always want to push those timetables so that you close those gaps for your seller client as quickly as possible, okay? That's with your financing, your inspection. 7-day turnaround is more than enough time. If they can do it in 5 days, 3 to 5 days, great. I wouldn't be allowing anything more than a 7-day window. Nope, not for your inspection contingency, because that's just another reason for them to pull out, right? And that same thing, as I stated, with the appraisal contingency. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yes.
I have a question because we're talking about my house quarter,
Mhm.
and I thought that contingencies that not accepted. So how do you get around that when someone's asking for it?
That's a very good question. Aurelia asks, how do you get around contingencies when somebody on the My House Porter platform is asking about contingencies? Very good question. So if the property makes it to auction, so during and after auction, those provisions apply. That being said, they are subject to the agreement between the parties. When that buyer's bid is accepted as the highest bid, then within 24 hours, that buyer has to submit their full offer to the seller for consideration. So remember last week when we were walking through the process and we were taking it from My House Porter and putting that link in for your brokerman accounts, that's where their full offer is going to be submitted. That full offer on all of your board documents with those terms and anything that they're requesting or offering to the seller is what's going to be submitted to the seller for consideration. If the seller counters and says, I'm not considering any contingency, then the contingency is going to be countered and stricken from the contract, sent back to the buyer. If the seller, however, agrees that they're willing to consider it, remember that all of the negotiation is between the parties. It's between the buyer and the seller. So if the seller agrees, then it can be effectuated into the contract. Okay, we have those things up there. We want for the buyer and the buyer's agents to follow them because we built the platform such that it is beneficial to our sellers. It's a tremendous benefit to them to have these things in their favor, because now you look like a rock star times 10 because you have this platform that is gonna, more than likely result in a contract that is going to be higher with less contingencies, less ways to back out, them netting more money and all of those things as a result. But the short and quick answer is it is up to the seller, whatever the parties agree to, okay? Now, sure, hold on 1 second. I wanted to make sure that I didn't go too far without addressing Kermon's earlier question. Kermon said, of these contingencies, which is the most important contingency? Did I hear that correctly, Kermon?
Absolutely.
All right. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. From what perspective? Are you talking about from the perspective of a listing agent or from the perspective of a buyer's agent?
I would think from the perspective of buyer's agent. And what I was thinking about, Ms. Porter, is when there is a contingency that they have to sell their home.
Gotcha. So that's one that's not even included. So I want to address it from the perspective of a listing agent first, because from the perspective of a listing agent, you represent the seller. No contingencies is the best situation, right? So if you have to consider any of them, then as light as possible with the seller's acceptance, then those are the ones that you will allow, the ones that the seller is willing to allow. But little to none is always going to be best when you're on the listing side. On the buying side, whatever the buyer needs is what you're going to insert into the contract, right? Because if you're representing the buyer, then you got to do what's in the buyer's best interest. It may say, no contingencies there, but your representation is the buyer. So you are going to present an offer that the buyer has requested based on their best interests, all right? A home sale contingency is a little bit different. That is one that takes a whole lot more time. Excuse me. So as it pertains to, let me ask a clarifying question to you, Kermon. Are you saying if it is a buyer who's purchasing from the My House Porter platform and has a home sale contingency, or outside in any transaction with a buyer who has a home sale contingency?
Well, let's just do with the platform, since that's what we're talking about. So with the platform.
That is going to be up to the seller's consideration. If the seller accepts it, then the seller can choose to accept it. Now, as it pertains to your offer review with the seller, that is probably going to be one of the most unattractive offers, the one that has the home sale contingency, unless that buyer has made it so much more attractive than all the competing offers that the seller just can't help his or herself because of how attractive the overall offer is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, so that's the thought. When you have a buyer that has special circumstances like that, you've got to have the conversation with them in advance that those things are going to be considered on a sliding scale. If they're already starting out with one thing that could potentially be, something that works against them, now they need to kind of they need to offer well above list price. They need to offer a great earnest money deposit. They need to be offering to pay, at least half, if not all, of the transfer and recordation. Now, of course, they don't have to do all of those things, but that buyer really needs to put their best foot forward in order to accommodate for what they're asking the seller to do. Because they're asking the seller, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, take your property off the market, turn down all the other buyers, accept my offer. I still have to go through a sales process in which I'm not even in control, because there's going to be another buyer and another agent who has financing that has to go through the process. And these are things that your seller is going to be subject to, right? Does it happen? All the time. Do we get our buyers through that process? Yes, all the time. But you want to make sure that you have a very transparent conversation with them in advance so they know the considerations that they need to make in that situation and putting their best foot forward so that their offer becomes attractive, opposed to it being one that the seller does not want to consider.
Okay, so if I can follow up with that.
Okay. Now, an option in that situation is to have the seller to, as a listing agent, one of the things that you can do is a sell with a rent back clause, right? If you have the seller to sell their property and they're going to settlement, and you already have it under a ratified contract, and now you're getting a contract on the property, but you're just waiting for your settlement, which is going to be happening within a week or 2 weeks or something like that, and you've already negotiated a rent back clause for your seller, which on the listing side, you're going to always try in this market to negotiate it for a free rent back clause with just a fully refundable earnest money deposit, not earnest money deposit, a deposit for your rent back. That is the highest and best value for your seller. Now, oftentimes buyers are going to counter you and their agents are going to counter you. So expect that they're going to say, you're going to ask for a free rent back for your seller. They're going to say, maybe a free rent back, but give me a $1,500 deposit. Or, you know what I mean? But that is when you're on the buying side, that is one of the terms that you consider to make your offer either more or less attractive to the seller. If you know that in the disclosures, the seller has put that they need a rent back period and you are the buyer's agent and you're saying, oh, you know what? The seller needs a rent back. I'm going to offer the seller a 1 month free rent back or 2 months free rent back. Now, when you're considering those offers and all of them are $550,000, but one of them is offering me 2 months free rent back and they have a home that needs to close because it's already under contract, that one looks a lot more attractive now. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
So those are some of the ways that we utilize each one of the points of, consideration in all of our negotiation tools when we're writing an offer on behalf of our buyer or on our seller. Does anybody have any questions?
Free rent back. Who's renting it back?
Aurelia asks, what does a free rent back look like and who's renting it back? So I can, you know what, I don't want to take us off course, but I can go ahead and explain it and we'll go through it so that you guys can see what it looks like. We have, let me see if I have a transaction I can open up for you really quickly there. So just in case you've never encountered it as of yet, if a seller, well, a buyer or a seller has an option to do what's called a rent back, or even it's called a pre or post settlement occupancy lease. So in the event that the buyer needed to occupy the property before settlement, it's called a pre-settlement occupancy lease. If the seller needs to occupy the property after settlement, then it's called a post-settlement occupancy lease. In which case, the client they're able to continue to occupy the property after they've already gone to settlement. Let me see if I have 145. Yes, if it's a rent back, then it's done by the seller. Let me see if I can get this. If I can't find it really quickly, then we're just going to talk about it and we'll come back to it. With that quick explanation that I just gave, does anybody have any questions about that? Okay, so we'll come back to that. I just wanted to make sure that you guys understood that. So if it is a rent back, you're going through the actual, it's a document that you're pulling from your MAR library for that. And all the information is going to be very straightforward. You simply fill it in as it pertains to the transaction. And you have your seller, you're going to, of course, ask for the highest and best terms for your seller. So you're asking for a free rent back. You might offer a deposit of some sort, maybe a small deposit, and you allow for the buyer to counter, right? You don't offer, a rent amount for the buyer. You let the buyer counter with that, all right? But that is one of the ways that you overcome having a seller that has a property to sell. You go ahead and you get that property under a ratified contract. Then when you go ahead and submit your offer for the other property, you're going to be submitting a copy of that ratified contract along with those terms that provide that your seller has, an upcoming settlement with a rent back addendum. So now it's just a matter of that property closing and they have the time that they need to get their loan approved as well. So that was a great question. And you know what? There was something else that I wanted to go through on that synopsis page. The settlement date, guys. What about the settlement date? Is that a term of negotiation? Aurelia says yes. Why is that a term of negotiation?
Because it gives the time frame that the buyer is expecting to close. Sometimes that's in between 30 to 45 days, depending on if they're on a program or something, and they need more time. But of course, you want to choose the person or the individual that can settle.
That was spot on. Aurelia said it is the time that the seller is going to be looking to close, and those factors are going to be affected based on the buyer's financing type and whether or not there's some type of program that may require more time. And it's in the seller's best interest oftentimes to work with the buyer who's able to close soonest. Okay. Now that is going to be the case most of the time. Why are we looking for the buyer that can close soonest in most cases? Let's dissect that a little bit, guys. Why is that train of thought? Why does that make sense?
Because time is of the essence. All I
Time
got.
is definitely of the essence.
That's all I got.
Well, you got it. That is spot on. Does anybody have any other considerations that may be affected by time?
Well, one thing I think it's really right in my head right now, Ms. Porter, is because of what interest rates are doing. So I'm just wondering if, interest rates can change if we don't have a lock, or the lock can expire. So I was thinking about that. I also was thinking about the fact that when people are trying to sell, they may already have another house they're ready to get. They don't want this thing to overlap. You don't want the possibility of paying 2 mortgages and then going into another month. So those are the things that came straight to my mind.
Herman brought his A game, guys. Come on, ladies. I know you guys have some other thoughts. Herman is dominating this conversation tonight. Come on. What are some other considerations? What about, so yes to those things that you've thrown out, and definitely those are factors that we want to make sure that we keep an eye out on, because if the buyer's interest rate goes up, then guess what? That buyer may no longer be approved for the property. What about credit? Is it, does it stay at whatever the number is, or does it fluctuate? Based on the time of the month, based on the month, does credit fluctuate? Do assets fluctuate? Do people's, spending habits fluctuate? If there's something that's going to hit your credit report and maybe, it wasn't there when you got your pre-approval, but now we're asking for a 60-day closing, and now you have something that just hit your credit report that wasn't there before, are these factors to be considered? What about a potential emergency that comes up and now you got to spend your closing costs? Or what about the cruise or the Beyonce concert? And we have literally had people who had both of those things. Wow. We've had people who, that the Beyonce concert came up and they had to buy those tickets, so they no longer had money for settlement. They had to take that cruise, and that was their settlement money. Had multiple people around Christmas time, they spent their settlement money on Christmas gifts. So
they didn't follow the 10 Commandments.
They did not follow the 10 Commandments, Kermon. They didn't follow it. So these are considerations, right? So you want to strike while the iron is hot. When they are approved, when they are fully pre-approved, well, you want them to be approved at that point, but you want to close as quickly as possible, because there are too many things that are left up in the air that you don't have control over. Too many things that are left to be unknown, and we cannot even control those things for our sellers at all. So that's why when you get that contract, it is a race to the settlement table, okay? Can anybody think of any time when we don't want to race to the settlement table for our sellers? There you go. Aurelia said when the seller needs more time. That is definitely a consideration. Now, that being said, there's still a conversation to be had with the seller as it pertains to a sale and a rent back. Because if the seller needs more time, of course, everything that you're going to be doing is on that seller's timetable, right? And you want to make sure that the offer that you're accepting on behalf of your seller is one that provides the seller the time that they need to do whatever it is that they need to do. Now, that being said, again, you're having that conversation with them. Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I know that you guys are, you have 60 days before whatever the case is. But how about we consider you selling and we're doing a rent back, and then by that time you would have sold the property and your 60 days is up. You give yourself an extra couple weeks, then you can take that couple weeks to move into your new property. That is a conversation to be had. Carmon mentioned something that pertains to rushing to the settlement day so that the seller doesn't have two mortgages. That is a very real consideration. That being said, however, at settlement, you'll notice on your settlement statements, I would say the majority of the time that buyer is not going to start paying that mortgage for another at least month to 2 months after they have settled. Now, if the seller needs, or the buyer who's purchasing the home needs time before they pay their mortgage, that is a conversation that you want to have with your loan officer, because they are able to affect that buyer's initial payment to tell that buyer when to begin payment. But that's a conversation that the buyer has to absolutely have with the loan officer. Because say by chance, this is March the 31st. If they close today, tomorrow's the 1st of April, they don't owe a mortgage tomorrow. You know what I mean? They probably won't owe a mortgage until May or June, depending on the financing. So have them to have that conversation with their lender in advance, you know, so that they say, hey, I need 2 or 3 months after I close before I pay a mortgage. It will affect their closing costs. They'll be able to pay some portion of it in interest so as to delay their so as to delay their payment for a certain amount of time. But that is a very important conversation that in the event, I'll say it one last time, that the buyer needs that to happen, you have them to talk to the lender about that before they get to settlement. All right. Very good thoughts there. All right. What about, so let's ask if the title company, if the buyer, you know, everything else is a go, you have 2 buyers with an identical contract, and one of them is willing to work with your title company and the other one is not willing to work with your title company. What consideration is it of the sellers, which title company the buyer chooses to work with? Is there any merit to that, or what is the concern? What do you guys think about that?
Because they're driving the car.
Aurelia said there's merit to sticking with the title company that you're driving. I'm sorry, that you're comfortable with, because they're the ones that are driving the car. So you want to be sure. That's a great way to say it. Anybody else? So the hope is that whatever title company is chosen, there will not be a problem. That is the hope. That being said, that is not the case often, quite often, okay? So when the buyer works with your title company, the title company that we work with, the attorney there represents Porterhouse, thereby representing our client. So they have a little bit more, you know, leverage in the event that anything were to happen. They have a lot more protection because they are a Porterhouse client and they are protected by our counsel for Porterhouse under our title company. So you want to have that conversation with the seller. You also want to have the conversation with the seller about the title company. If by chance it's just some fly-by-night title company, who is their insurer? If there's title insurance to be purchased, how do we even know that this company is going to be around to pay in the event that anything were to happen? So there are considerations as it pertains to the title company. And for our clients, say by chance you're in a transaction and the buyer and the seller chose to let the title company hold the earnest money deposit. If it's a Porterhouse buyer, as a brokerage, we hold the earnest money deposit, not the title company. However, if you're on the listing side, you can have the title company to hold the earnest money deposit, because chances are, if you're the listing agent, the buyer's agent is not going to let the listing broker hold the earnest money deposit. And that makes a lot of sense because they want to protect their buyer. But they're a lot more willing to allow for the title company to hold it. So you want to make sure it's your title company. In the event that there's any type of deposit dispute, the title company only requires one party signature in order to initiate a deposit release. That means if you're working with the seller and the buyer is bullying the title company and they send them over a release, the title company could technically release the deposit to the buyer without having signatures from all parties. Okay, and it's up to the attorney's discretion at that title company. That's why you want to make sure that the buyer is working with your title company so that your and your client's best interests are those that are at the front of the line. Because whoever chooses that title company, if they have a relationship with them, you know, provided everything goes well, it's not even a consideration, but things happen. So you want to make sure that you and your client and the brokerage and everybody is protected from having that type of, you know, kind of conflict that could go back and forth there. And we've had a title company, we've had a couple title companies in the past to do some things that we said, okay, we would never work with them again. Of course, I can't say their names, wouldn't say their names, don't want to spew anything about the business, but just know that it is definitely a good practice to know the people that you're working with and to kind of just like, not sure if we have a lot of, you know, football fans on the line, but if you have your quarterback and you have your running back and you have, come on, you can give me whatever the other positions are played on the field, and you have your wide receivers out there.
Right.
Your quarterback is passing it to your running back. Your quarterback is the lender. Your running back is the title company. They got to make sure that they pass it, you know, to the wide receiver and they run a touchdown. Did I get that right, Kermon?
You got that right. That's pretty good.
Kudos to Mr. Porter. You know, he's had me in football. So there you go. But that being said, when you're working with a team that is used to working together and they're your team, they're going to be a lot more structured. They're going to get your clients to settlement a lot more seamlessly than your teams that have never worked together and they're having these odds and things that are happening in the midst of a transaction and they're trying to figure it out at your client's expense for the first time. You know what I mean? Can it happen successfully? Yes, it can happen successfully. Are there glitches that happen more times than not? Yes, there are. Now, that being said, we don't want to cause our sellers to panic if there's another title company. There's no reason to panic, okay? It's about it being in their best interest, all right? Does that make sense to everybody? All right. What about the lender? You have a buyer that's working with the lender that has a great track record and everything else is the same in terms of the merits of the offer. And you have another buyer that may be working with a brand new lender, and every time you've gotten an offer from that lender, he's pre-qualified people who are, you know, he didn't even pull any of their documents to make sure that he vetted the credit, income, and assets, and you have transactions falling through back to back as a result of pre-approvals that were issued by that lender. Does the strength of the lender hold any merit in the offer that's being written? What do you guys think about that? I'm going to start the Jeopardy clock. What do you guys think? This is a safe space. Just tell me what your thoughts are. So the answer to that question is yes. If you get multiple offers, say by chance you have 10 offers and you're trying to vet the offers, you have, you know, your top 3, they're the same in terms of the purchase price. They don't need any closing costs. They're all trying to close in 21 to 30 days. Now you're going down to the lender and you're going down to the title company because why? Your goal is to direct your client in choosing the best offer, the offer that is the most financially sound and the one that has the best possible chance in getting to settlement. Because the goal is to get across that settlement threshold for your client. So you're reaching out to the lenders and you are asking them, you know, questions to make sure that they've done their due diligence to vet the buyer. Know that there are some lenders that are giving out letters. Let's just say when buyers go online, they type in their information, they're printing out a pre-approval and they want to go shopping for the house. Those are not worth the paper that they're printed on. Just be aware of that. And you want to have that conversation with buyers. That being said, some lenders still have that practice. They look at the buyer's credit score. Oh, you can be pre-approved. They let the buyer fill in the information. Okay, well, this is what your income is. This is what your credit score is. This is what your pre-qualification is. That being said, what our lender does, Michael Cooper, he is not going to issue your buyer a pre-approval until he has thoroughly vetted the credit, the income, and the assets, until he's thoroughly vetted that debt to income ratio, until he's gotten a verification of employment, until he's seen all of their documents to make sure that this buyer can actually go to closing. What he does is more along the lines of vetting the buyer for a successful closing versus just giving them an initial lender letter. That is the difference. So when you hear Mr. Porter say that Michael Cooper has closed 99% of all of the buyers that he's ever sent us, he has, and that's why. Other lenders are willing to send you a lender letter in 30 minutes. You send them a buyer, by 30 minutes, you have a pre-qualification from that buyer, and the lender hasn't done any legwork. What benefit is it to you, the buyer or the seller, to have a quick lender letter without having done any of the proper steps that were necessary to vet that buyer and make sure that when they're sitting at that settlement table, they're cheering because you've gotten them to settlement and they closed on the property, versus hearing from the lender, your financing has fell through. Okay. And that was a term heard all too often in the real estate industry because lenders were just passing out lender letters like somebody passing out candy. And we just really had to scratch a number of lenders from our books years ago who did that. You want to make sure that your buyer is able to close once they're given that lender letter. So if you guys use Michael Cooper, great, because he's excellent. If you use a different lender, make sure that they follow those same standards. All right. So when you're calling the lender on behalf of your seller client and you're vetting that buyer and getting as much information as you can, you want to know what things that lender has done in advance, right? You want to know if they vetted this buyer, how well they vetted them, what things they've checked. You want to have them, if they are willing to send you something, with that information as well. Every now and again, you're going to get an excellent lender who has a great team and they're on it, and they're going to call you and they're going to say, hello to Linton, my buyer is submitting an offer on your listing at 777 Prosperity Lane, and I wanted to just call and let you know this is a very well qualified buyer. We have verified their funds to close. Their ratios look great. Everything is a go. We can close in 21 days. Every now and again, you're going to get a very diligent lender who will do that. If you do, does that hold any weight when you have 3 offers that look the same and the other lender maybe brand new, or they're known for passing out lender letters that they can't close? Does that hold any weight?
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely, Angela. That is why you put that information on your synopsis when you're on the buying agent side. That's why you provide them with that information up front so that that listing agent is able to call the parties and do their own due diligence, right? It's one thing for them to take your word, but they want to do their own due diligence and find out for their seller client to make sure that they've done everything possible to, provide their client with all of the duties that are due. So definitely that is a consideration. All right. Any other thoughts that pertains to that?
Ms. Porter, I can speak to this. I was a loan officer for 6 years, and I can tell you everything that you said is spot on and amen, because it used to be where people would think that they have a pre-approval letter and all they had was a pre-qualified letter. And they were totally 2 different things. And even like you said, some of the pre-approval letters weren't worth the paper they were written on. And it's really sad because people go out, they fall in love with the house. They think everything is great. They think everything is good. And at the end, it doesn't go through. And what they would say is, well, the buyer's financing fell through. And a lot of people think that the buyer didn't have the money, when it was really the lender who dropped the ball, who didn't do the due diligence, who kept asking for the same documents 10, 15 times, never got everything right. So it really happens a lot. And that's the reason why we learned that relationships in this business, when you really have relationship and you're working with like a Mike Cooper and like a Velocity Title, it makes all the difference in the world, because I've gone through a lot of headaches, and we've had a lot of stories when people did not do that, and it really hurt people because they lost their house.
It really does. If you have a buyer who's looking forward to settling and that buyer's financing is falling through, who are they going to blame? They're going to blame everybody in that transaction. You are the fault, the lender's the fault, the title company is the fault, everybody's the fault. Why? And partially it's true, because we are the professionals in the transaction, and we're the ones that, provided the buyer follows our guidance, we're leading them to people that can get them through the transaction if they just follow the instructions, right? So if the buyer came and they have a lender you've never heard of, never worked with, you look up the lender, you can't find any positive information about the lender. Should you encourage the buyer to stick with that lender, or do you want to have that buyer to get pre-approved by somebody that you know did their due diligence? I see your mouth moving, Talita, but you're on mute. Take it off and say what you had to say.
I said somebody that you know. It's better to get someone you know.
You got it. You want to make sure that you know the person has done their due diligence, guys. Because at the end of the day, that buyer, you're going to be the one that they see most often. So if that transaction is a success, they're happy with you. If it is a failure, they are upset with you. And you don't touch lending, not even in the least bit, but you will be the bad guy as well. So I want you to do what you need to do to help protect the buyer and provide them the things they need, even when they don't understand why it's in their best interest, okay? So that being said, on the listing side, you are paying attention to the lender, all right? That being said, there are lots of great lenders out there. They are not all created equally. I think, in about, over a decade, I've had probably about maybe 4 or 5 lenders that I would say were really good. A couple, I would say, were exceptional. One has the best track record, and that's the one that we use, okay? So have the buyer to be patient when they're working with the lender. You get to know the lender. Each lender, they kind of do things. There's a lot of overlay, but then there's some things that their teams are going to do differently. Have them to be patient. I always say have the buyer to pack their patience. Rhonda always reiterates that. Have the buyer to pack their patience. Have the buyer to know that when they begin the process, create an electronic file for everything that lender requests. Because not only is the lender going to request it again, but the underwriting staff is going to request it. If they have a junior loan officer, all of them have to request certain documents multiple times throughout the transaction just to make sure that things are not fraudulent and for a number of other reasons, but just let them know to anticipate having to turn in certain documents, several times, right? And then for them to have it in a place, like I said, electronic file so that they can get it over to them quickly. Anytime they get a new pay statement, anytime they get a new bank statement, have them to proactively submit that to the lender so that the lender does not have to wait to update the pre-approval should they need to because they don't have the most current financial information. Make sense?
Yes.
All right, so all of that came from the first couple questions. Let's see if we can make it back through these terms and conditions. That came from that financing. There you go. That came from that financing contingency. And that came from, we didn't even get to the inspection contingency just yet. But let's talk it through, because on the My House Porter platform, financing, if the sale is not contingent upon financing. Somebody tell me what that means when you see the language not contingent upon financing, that the contract is not contingent upon financing. If your buyer submits the high bid and the seller accepts their high bid and takes it off the market, it's not contingent upon financing. What does that mean? Does that mean that the buyer can't get financing?
It may be a cash buyer.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that people may think. I want to hear what you guys think, because I want us to talk through these. I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Aurelia said, no, it does not mean that. Talita said, does that mean it needs to be a cash buyer? Anybody else have any other thoughts?
It sounds like it can, they can get financing. It's just this particular contract isn't contingent on it. It's not going to hold up the sale.
So I want you to elaborate. So stay on that point, Angela, and elaborate. What does that mean, not contingent?
Well, there's no way out. And if they default and are unable to obtain financing, it looks like they may either lose their earnest money deposit. I mean, you can't force them to purchase the property, but they would lose their deposit.
Spot on. That's it. Ding, ding, ding. There you go.
Not
So
a
the
deal
buyer
breaker.
can, Joy, there you go. So yes, you guys got it. So Talita, yes, it can be a cash buyer. Any buyer can purchase, right? They can use any financing type, whether it's FHA, VA, conventional, some type of rehab loan, whatever type of financing, they can use any type of financing that they choose. They can also purchase with cash. The property is simply, the sale is not contingent upon financing, which means that if the seller removes it from the platform and goes under contract with that buyer and pushes all the other buyers to the side, then this contract, if the buyer does not produce and go to settlement, then they are not getting their earnest money deposit back. Okay, so they got to do what they got to do to get to settlement. If they need an extension, they need to ask for an extension, but they got to make sure that their pre-approval or their pre-qualification is in order, because their financing needs to be sure. Just like the conversation that we were talking about, a perfect segue into it. You want to make sure that that buyer, they have a solid pre-approval, because we're not talking about, oh, we've gotten our seller all the way up to the day of settlement, and now your financing is falling through, and you've cost my seller 30 days, another $3,000 on their mortgage, and for them to, turn all of these other contracts away, and you're saying, oh, financing fell through, I'm walking away from the deal. No. Okay. So that is what that means. The buyer can get financing. Let's make sure that we are all on the same page with that. And 9 times out of 10, the buyer will be financing the purchase of the property. Okay, everything is financeable, even with that 3.5% buyer's premium, as we've talked about a number of times before. It's added to the cost of the sale, so it's not any additional or extra money that the buyer brings to the table. It serves just like we've done so many times in the industry when a buyer needed closing costs. It's simply added onto the purchase price. So now the purchase price is financeable. Depending on their loan type, that determines what, the percentages that they put down versus the piece that's financed. Okay?
Have a question.
Yes.
Back to my question of placing offer, because I've never seen
Mhm.
the offer when it hits the portal.
Mhm.
Because you mentioned something about, and then they're going to send the details.
Mhm.
So what is in the offer when it goes to the portal? Is it naming contingencies that the buyers expect?
Aurelia's asking what's included in the offer on the My House Porter platform. On the My House Porter platform, it is just the person's name, their email address, the agent's name, and the bidding price. So how much they're bidding. So they are not submitting any information per se as it pertains to documents on the My House Porter platform, right? They are just submitting what their highest bid is. And that's why this stipulates that, let's see, upon the high bid being accepted by the seller, then the buyer needs to wire their 1% earnest money deposit. Okay, within 24 hours, they need to submit a full contract. Signed purchase agreement must also be submitted within 24 hours of acceptance, right? That's because on the platform itself, it is just a bid. So they're letting the seller know how much they are willing to pay. Everything else is going to be subject to the actual offer that's going to be submitted to you guys through your brokerment platform. That offer submitted to you guys in brokerment is going to include all of the terms and conditions that the buyer is accepting and or offering or requesting from the seller. Does that make sense?
And this is what brings me to the next one. Okay, I think we have gone over the 3 areas, main areas of contingency.
Mm-hmm.
So I put a bid on there,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that I'm going to ask for contingency upon financing, even though this thing that the sale is not based on that. So how do you get around that? Now the seller has selected my offer or my bid, and now I put this in there. Is that now negotiable between the seller and the?
Aurelia has asked a great question. As it pertains to the financing contingency, buyers and buyers agents are going to try to get around it. So how do you manage it? She's asking, does it become up to the seller? And the answer to that is yes. So through the platform, it says that it's not subject to financing. If the buyer signs off on this and includes this with their offer, then that is saying that they are not, as long as this matches the residential contract of sale, that's going to stipulate which contingencies they intend to include in the sale of the property, then it will either be added or taken away or countered or whatever the case is. But it is up to the seller. So essentially, just to put this in a nutshell, yes, a buyer could submit an offer through brokerment when they have the high bid in My House Porter that requests contingencies, although your My House Porter platform said contingencies will not be allowed. A buyer could very well offer it with contingencies anyway and allow for the seller to counter it. In which case, as the seller's agent, you must submit it to the seller and allow the seller to make the decision. Yep. Very good question. All right, inspection is the buyer's responsibility to get the inspection. We went over the deposit. We went over, let's see, purchase agreement being due within 24 hours, the balance being due at settlement. Let's talk about paragraph number 13, because I want to make sure that we are all aware that this is simply a settlement. Settlement at settlement. The lender is going to fund the loan. That's going to transfer to the title company. The title company is going to have all the money in-house that the seller needs in order to close out that amount due at settlement from the buyer. The buyer will simply be wiring their portion or their closing costs, okay? Just want to make sure that you guys are aware that that balance that's due as settlement, that is coming from the buyer's loan, along with whatever the closing cost that the buyer has due, right? So you want to make sure that that buyer wires their money to the title company before settlement. You don't want to get to settlement and there's no money there from the buyer, because then your settlement is held up, right? I just want to, let's see, we have 6 minutes left. Okay, so then I won't take a
Yeah,
segue because I'm going
Can I ask a quick
to make it through the
question?
rest. Yes, of course.
This is regarding the inspection. It says buyer is responsible for having the property inspected. On the auction platform, if it's just a one-day open house, is that just negotiated after the open house with the seller as to let
Very
them
good
do the
question.
inspection?
Very good question. So that is going to be in the actual offer from the buyer, because at the open house, buyers are just coming to see if they're interested, if they want to bid on it at auction, right? Now, once they bid, their bid is going to include their price that they're willing to offer. Once the high bid is accepted by the seller, then that's when their full offer is going to come over, including or excluding any contingencies that they would like to add. If they are asking for an inspection contingency, that inspection contingency is going to be included in the body of their offer. The body of their offer is submitted to you guys in your BrokerMet platform. So when you actually see that offer, then you'll be able to see if that buyer has asked for an inspection contingency, in which case the seller has to decide whether or not they're willing to accept it. And then whatever amount of days they requested, whether it be 5 days or 7 days, they have to get their inspection done at that time. So just to make sure that there's no ambiguity there, the inspection is not done pre-open house, the inspection is not done at the open house. The inspection is done if it is accepted by the seller, by the buyer whose offer is accepted after that auction period has ended, once they're ratified. That makes sense to everybody?
Yes, thank you.
You got it. Great question. All right, buyer's premium, that's straightforward, 3.5%. You know, I'm glad I thought about this. So My House Porter is officially being, well, My House Porter is officially its own entity now. Okay, so myhouseporter.com is officially its own entity. So that 3.5% buyer's premium, 2.5% goes to pay the buyer's agent. That 1% that is left over goes to myhouseporter.com. Okay. Closing costs. The purchaser will be responsible for any expenses related to their financing, so forth and so on. Taxes, this information is actually done by the title company. So that is something that's there as a convenience, but this is not our wheelhouse. This is not something that we have to explain, the proration of taxes. All right. Let's see, final bids are irrevocable by the bidder. So the property will be sold to the highest bidder subject to seller confirmation. So if a bidder is like, okay, well, I bid it 575, you know, I didn't mean to be at 575. I want to reduce it to 545. It doesn't work that way, you know, so they will be kicked out of the bidding process for that. Successful bidder will be required to sign the approved real estate purchase agreement. And that goes hand in hand with what we've been saying. 24 hours. Yep. 24 hours. Yes. Yep. So time is of the essence, as Kermon has stated and reiterated throughout our training. Time is of the essence. So when that buyer wins on the platform, now their time is of the essence. They have 24 hours to submit an offer their full offer with that purchase price that they committed to in the platform and send over their earnest money deposit. All right.
Jasmine,
Yes.
I know on here it says that it says just 1% earnest money deposit is due. Is it always 1%? Can it be more than 1%?
Great.
Just curious.
Great question. The earnest money deposit can be as much as the buyer would like for it to be. That being said, for the platform, we have required, for the sake of our sellers' protection, a minimum of 1%. That 1% is not prescribed by law. It is for the platform, for us to protect our seller and to make sure that the buyer has some skin in the game and the buyer is serious. Because of that, we start at 1%, but the buyer absolutely can go up to as much as they would like as an earnest money deposit. As a point of negotiations in the contract, in fact, it makes their offer a lot stronger if they offer more in the earnest money deposit. Just wanted to point out that that 1% was a correction that was made. If you have printed this form before now, or if you have it in any of your disclosures before, it would have said 3.5%. 3.5% was a typo. We are only requiring a 1% earnest money deposit. If the buyer can do 3.5%, great, but it's not required.
So do you think the language is saying a minimum?
Yes. Yep.
Right now it says 8, and I can see why there's the question, because it says a 1%.
Yep.
So maybe it should say a minimum,
All right, that's something to consider.
because that way that kind of gives the buyer the notation, well, if I want to give more, because I'm out and
So Aurelia is elaborating on the question that you asked, Angela, talking about the language, saying if we want to adjust it to say a minimum of 1%. And I think that that is a very good notation to be made, because if the buyer wants to go above that, they can absolutely go above that.
So if someone bids on the property, though, we're not going to know what their earnest money deposit is. It's not going to be determined until that particular bid is accepted. So, I mean, I do agree that maybe minimum can be listed there, but only one person's going to be considered for that earnest money deposit.
that's true.
You got it. That's right. Both of you are spot on. All right, broker participation invited. The 2.5% referral fee is paid to the buyer's agent, right? That being said, you want to make sure that that buyer's agent is the one who reaches out to you first. You want to make sure that the buyer is not the one reaching out to you saying, hey, Joy, hey, Angela, hey, Aurelia, I see you have a property coming up. I'd like to make an offer on that property. I want to bid, and they're reaching out to you to get all the information. And then the date of the actual offer, they have a buyer's agent to call and say, hey, I represent such and such buyer. You know what I mean? The terms of this platform say that the buyer needs to come through their agent, and we want to keep the buyers honest, keep them accountable to the agent that represents them. So you want to make sure that when you talk to them, one of the first questions that you ask is, do you have an agent? Are you represented? If so, make sure that your agent calls me as it pertains to your offer on this platform. You don't want the buyer to disqualify their agent from receiving that 2.5% broker participation fee, okay? So have that conversation with them, verify whether or not they are represented. If they are represented, make sure that they come through their agent. If they are not represented, then great. So you don't have to worry about it. But if they are represented, make sure that they're not reaching out to you. And I said that a few times on purpose, because we had a transaction with the property that ended up going for 1.2 million. Buyers are reaching out the whole time, and we're like, do you have an agent? And they're like, I do have an agent, but I don't have to work with my agent. I want to work with you and such. Like, I need you to have your agent to call me. Otherwise, you will disqualify them from receiving a commission for it. On this bidding platform, things are a little bit different, and we want to honor our fellow real estate agents. So please make sure that the buyers are accountable and they do what it says in their buyer brokerage agreement. And they're not reaching out to you to submit bids on their behalf, and they know they have a real estate agent. All right. And then 21, the buyer's responsible for all transfer and recordation costs. All right. If the buyer does not specify anything different in their residential contract of sale, then they will be responsible for all of the transfer and recordation costs. If you receive an offer from the buyer with that high bid amount specified and something different, you want to highlight that and go over those terms with the seller, ensuring that the seller notices that the buyer has effectuated a counter to that provision in paragraph number 21 of these terms and conditions. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, the platform says this, the buyer has offered a counter to that term. Is this something that is acceptable to you? And allow the seller to make that decision, okay? These are terms and conditions that we are putting out so that the buyer and the buyer's agents are well aware of what the platform entails. However, you want to make sure that all negotiations go between the buyer and the seller. And what you are communicating is on behalf of your seller based on the seller's considerations and the things that are most pertinent to them.
Mm.
Make sense to everybody?
Yes.
All right, well, we've made it through those terms and conditions. We're not going to be able to get to our marketing for our open house marketing this evening, but that was a great conversation surrounding the terms and conditions for the My House Porter platform. Does anybody have any other questions?
Yeah, Ms. Porter.
Yes.
Okay, I do have one question.
Mhm.
You said if the buyer is not represented by an agent, so let's say they're not, and they just want to do it themselves. What happens to that 2.5? Does it go back to, can the seller's agent receive that, or it just goes away, or what?
So you have two options. If the buyer's unrepresented, the buyer can say, hey, Kerman, I want you or somebody on your team to represent me. If they want you or somebody on your team to represent you, then whoever is designated receives a commission for it. If they say, I choose to stay and remain unrepresented, then that goes to the My House Porter platform. You can absolutely, yes, that other 2.5% goes to the My House Porter platform. So you
Okay.
have the opportunity when you're doing your open houses that for the buyers that come unrepresented, you have an opportunity for you or somebody that you're working with on your team. That's why I'm always encouraging you guys to have multiple people at the open houses with you so that you have support needed, because the name of the game is getting those leads, those unrepresented buyers. And if they allow you to represent them, guess what? You're getting commission for the buyer that you're representing. In Maryland, of course, you cannot represent both buyer and the seller, but somebody that's on your team can. If they come through you or somebody on your team, then both people are paid based on the commissions that are in the contract that have been negotiated. If they do not, again, want to be represented at all, it will go to the platform.
Got it.
Great question.
Okay. Thank you.
All right.
What are the,
And Aurelia has one last question in closing. It's 8:35.
on Virginia and DC?
So Virginia and DC do allow for dual agency. So in the event that the buyer wants for you to represent them, then that has to be clearly articulated. You got to have a buyer brokerage agreement with them. They've got to come through you to the platform, and you're going to provide that information. All right. And for those that are licensed in DC as well as Virginia, you know that both of those have dual agency. Okay, with proper disclosures and all of the things that we will talk through. In the event that you find yourself in that situation, you let me know so I can make sure that we cross our T's and dot our I's. All right, guys, we are done for the evening. You guys have been wonderful. I tell you, you brought your A game today. Does anybody have any final thoughts before we end this evening? It is a few minutes after, it's 8:36. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.